We are live in Hong Kong, where these charred towers stand as the stark reminder of fragility amid progress. One of the city's worst fires has left 94 people dead and 76 injured. I'm Yvonne Mann. This is Insight, and today we examine how such a disaster could strike one of the world's richest cities, with attention now on issues from building codes to fire safety regulations. Also on the show today, Asian stocks are losing momentum even as Chinese equities get a major vote of confidence from JP Morgan with an overweight recommendation. Capital Group's Eddie Budden joins us with his view on how geopolitical tensions and AI-related disruption are pivotal for global markets. We'll get his take on this whole reallocation they're seeing globally. With the Philippines gripped by a corruption scandal involving ministers, senators, and some of its richest people, we discuss whether graft allegations could spell the end of another Marcos administration. And as we await India's GDP growth numbers, we'll examine the pressures on the economy, including U.S. tariffs, with Nomura economist Sonal Varma. Hong Kong firefighters say that they are close to completing their search of 7 burnt-out apartment towers after fires now known to have killed at least 94 people. Dozens of survivors remain in the hospital, with hundreds more left homeless as a criminal investigation continues into the cause of the disaster. Let's bring in our China correspondent, Min Lo. She joins us now from one of the shelters here in the city with the latest. Min, we're approaching close to 48 hours since this blaze first began. What's the latest now?
Yes, the fire department this morning completed the search and rescue. They were forcibly entering every single unit of the burnt buildings to ensure no one was left behind. The death toll you mentioned earlier already. There was no update of the number of missing people. As of yesterday, it was in the hundreds. Not sure if any of those has been resolved so far. But here I am close to one of the official evacuation centers. But this area is just about a block away from the center of the scene of the fire, but this area was entirely self-organized. Behind me you can see comforters, sheets, blankets, tents, and then there are daily necessities like shampoo, soaps, even disposable underwear, just everything that you might need to sleep over for a day to keep people comfortable. And it's just random residents here donating things. They found an empty space here and they started setting things up. Nobody could give me an answer as to, how long is this going to stay here. They were saying that, they don't know if they will be chased away. It just entirely sprung up organically. So that's really heartening to see. It's not just the residents, it's the corporate donations as well. We have all the tech giants in China, Tencent, Xiaomi, Alibaba, Xpeng, all looking at tens of millions of Hong Kong dollars worth of donation. The Hong Kong conglomerates as well, including the Li Ka-shing Foundation, the Henderson Group as well. Over here you can see water. There are instant noodles, food, and the like. And on the other side, if you come over here, you can see a triage area, a medical tent being set up for anybody who needs attention to any minor scrapes and bruises. And right now, just overnight, when I came here earlier this morning, I did see some residents sleeping overnight in the market center inside this shopping mall. So they were just sleeping on mattresses that they grabbed from this area. But longer term, that's the question, right? I spoke to some of the residents. I remember one man told me that he's hoping that he could go home tonight, which doesn't seem very realistic. But some others are saying they have no idea if they're going to stay here for another night. It seems like they're just still overwhelmed and dazed and taking things one day at a time. But longer term, the government has said they have identified 1,800 of these empty apartment units that could serve as transitional housing. In the meantime, in the interim, there are 9 of these official shelters, mostly community centers, that will be kept open as long as there are residents who need it. There are hotels participating in giving out free hotel rooms for the next couple of weeks just to tide the residents through.
And tell us a bit more about, we heard from the Chief Executive, John Lee, yesterday talking about there's going to be a citywide inspection when it comes to some of the, fire safety regulations and the like. I think the Anti-Corruption Bureau, ICAC, has also looked into, the criminal allegations and really what could come out from that. You know, people are looking for answers, and right now it seems like there's still a lot of questions about what could come out of these investigations too.
Yeah, I think that is one of the most disappointing thing about yesterday's presser was that, yes, they talked about the financial aid, 10,000 Hong Kong dollars for each family, which is really little if you consider the cost of living here. But there wasn't enough reflection about the cause of the fire. And yes, the government has said they're going to phase out all bamboo scaffolding. But at this point, some residents are saying this is perhaps diverting attention from the crux of the matter, because the Department of Labor, as recently as last week or a week ago, had already visited the site of the renovations, already discovered the substandard materials. In fact, they inspected multiple times, and yet it seemed like nothing was done to prevent the fire. So there's questions of accountability here. Who should be held responsible? It's not just the 3 men who were arrested from the engineering company. Is there some sort of fault that the Department of Labor needs to take responsibility for as well? And the government has set up a task force to investigate corruption. It seems like there is concern about potential irregularities when it comes to the contracting, when it comes to oversight. And of course, it's not just the bamboo scaffolding. The reason why people are saying that this could be a diversion of attention is that they're saying it's also the green mesh, right? The authorities acknowledged that the speed of the fire on the mesh was faster than expected. There were the plastic tarps and all the things that didn't meet compliance standards as well.
Thank you. Min Min Lo there, China correspondent on the ground there on what's happening here in Hong Kong. We'll have much more from the fire disaster. The city's government says it will end the use of traditional bamboo scaffolding. Later on this hour, we're going to get risk assessments from the likes of University of Queensland lecturer Anwar Orabi and Hong Kong Polytechnic University Associate Professor Xinyan Huang. All right, we have to deter and really look at other things now and really steer away from the tragedy, unfortunately. But, you know, obviously our heavy hearts are still with the people of Hong Kong. You take a look at how markets and how we're ending up with this week, and it looks like we're still, I guess you could say, sluggish but flat when it comes to markets are concerned. You know, Hong Kong certainly is one thing we're focusing on here, given the fact that we're getting earnings from Meituan, which is expected to see one of the first losses in a few years as well for that company. Alibaba, you are seeing a little bit of green there, just given what we saw, this announcement of these new glasses that uses the Quinn AI technology. That's helping the stock rise about 0.8%. Wonka, you are seeing, you know, the two stocks are doing a bit differently in Hong Kong as well as in the mainland here today. We are up about 1.4% there. I believe those are the 8 shares, but certainly what you're seeing right now is still a lot of uncertainty about the developer there. That still is leading to maybe some weakness here in markets. But you take a look at how the property developers index, that's still slightly lower by about 0.5% here today. Hang Seng is down about 1%. Onshore markets doing a little bit better. It's interesting, though, with that JP Morgan upgrade when it came to China stocks. They're still thinking that things are looking pretty positive, right? Multiple factors are saying when it comes to the AI adoption sort of thing. So overweight is what they're recommending here when it comes to this market, and really kind of contrasts what we heard from Morgan Stanley talking about maybe we're going to see some consolidation and the like moving forward here. China Wanka also rejected by those 2 local banks, so we're focusing very closely on the property side of things as well. Joining us now is Andy Budden, Capital Group Investment. He's the head of solutions for Europe and Asia at the firm, which is more than $3 trillion in assets under management. You talk about this great sort of theme, right? This whole great global restructuring that we're seeing, where people are really starting to doubt maybe just the whole U.S. exceptionalism theme. Where are we now in this whole debate?
Well, good morning, Yvonne, and I mean, thank you for having me on this rather tragic day. And I mean, where we're at is that we're still looking at the great global restructuring as being the biggest restructuring we've seen in the world really since the Second World War. It's reshaping how economies compete, it's reshaping investor flows as well. And it's driven in part by productivity growth, which is obviously driven by artificial intelligence, and that's really trumping other drivers of economic growth. But we're also seeing kind of investment flows, trade flows being reshaped by geopolitics, and we're also seeing improving corporate governance in Asia in particular, which is really starting to challenge US dominance. So we're really trying to figure out who are going to be the winners that harness artificial intelligence, adapt to these changing investment and trade flows, and also really start to challenge US exceptionalism.
how does China fit into that sort of theme, right? You talk about AI. Certainly that's the reason why we're seeing this market do so well this year. We've had a little bit of pullback in this current quarter, but what are your expectations that this market could really continue to outperform the U.S.?
Well, I'd look at China more broadly in the context of Asia and say that it's right at the heart of this great global restructuring. I mean, Asian markets, okay, maybe a little bit weaker in recent days, but actually have had a very, very strong year, driven in part by consumer trends, in part by government spending, also by central bank activity. But actually in Asia, one of the things we've been really focused on is actually corporate governance. We like to invest our clients' assets in companies where managements are really focused on generating shareholder value. US for decades has been the systemic leader, but what we've seen in recent years in Asia is government actions driving improving corporate governance. The first mover was Japan, and over the last decade, return on equity in Japan has actually doubled. Korea was the next mover with the Value Up program, just under 2 years old, but already actually the Value Up index has outperformed an already strong KOSPI by almost 15%. And we're also seeing it in China. I don't think it's any coincidence, Yvonne, that the rally in Chinese equities this year coincided with the start of the market value management program in China, really focused on corporate governance.
You mentioned about the domestic consumption side of China surging amid export slowdown. I mean, I think most economists would say the consumption story is still a bit of a mixed picture here, and still sluggish to say the least. What sort of bright spots are you seeing in the consumption space specifically?
Yeah, for full disclosure, Yvonne, I'd agree that consumption trends have, well, maybe not been sluggish, but they've been resilient, but there's no immediate sign of a big upturn at the moment. And part of that is, of course, the continued problems in the property sector, where prices are still declining, inventory levels are really not showing any improvement. And unsurprisingly, that does impact consumer confidence. But there are still some pockets of strength, and in fact, there are more than pockets. The middle-class consumer in China, in particular, really starting to change the way they spend, with much greater focus on experiences as well as simply material possession. And that's going to be a very important trend moving forwards, Yvonne.
And what does it mean for investors then, in terms of how they position around this market now? Right now, it seems like there's a lot of, you still debate about concentration risks around AI. Can this rally actually broaden beyond just the tech space?
Well, yes, I think so. And it really points to the outlook, not just in China, Yvonne, but actually more broadly. I mean, as we look into 2026, I think the outlook is positive, and it's driven partly by economic revival. And the starting point there absolutely is kind of government spending, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. It's also kind of fiscal stimulus in Germany, but also in China as well. It's helped by central banks. Obviously, the Fed is easing. Yes, maybe the Bank of Japan and the ECB, maybe their next move will be to tighten, but that's actually moving at a very measured pace. But critically, we have earnings per share growth in most major markets expected to accelerate up into the low to mid-teens next year. And it's not just in the US Magnificent Seven or tech stocks. The US market is broadening, but actually we're expecting to see much stronger returns from the rest of the world. And really the only thing that we're worried about right now is really valuations. And obviously valuations are stretched, especially in the AI-oriented stocks. So there's limited room for disappointment, but actually we'd see any market pullbacks next year really as an opportunity to add to our positions.
Great. In terms of just, you mentioned about some of the governance sort of reforms that we're seeing in this part of the world. You mentioned the Value Up program in Korea. Japan certainly has been driving a lot of that here in the region, even some parts China. How do you see these reforms kind of sizing up to what we see in the U.S. in particular? Is that gap, you think, kind of narrowing more now?
Yes, the gap is narrowing, and I'd emphasise, Yvonne, that this is going to be a very long investment theme. Improving governance is not a trade. It's actually a kind of longer-term evolution, which firstly narrows the valuation gap, but then leads to improving fundamentals. And I think Japan is a really great case study, because it's been going there for more than a decade. It all started with Abenomics back in the early teens. And what we've seen since then is essentially earnings per share growth in Japan over the last decade is actually higher than the US. So it's quite a remarkable outcome. And so it's partly about closing the gap, but then it's also about just competing at a higher level. And it's not that the US is going to become less exceptional, but I think it's more that the rest of the world is going to become more exceptional. And that's very, very compelling for investors.
Andy, hold that thought. We have more from Andy Budden there, Capital Group Head of Solutions for Europe and Asia. He's staying with us as we take a closer look at, of course, the growing market concerns around an AI bubble as well. We have plenty more to come. This is Bloomberg.
We are bullish on the AI theme. We have been for a while. In the US, I think for us, the concern is a bit more around the valuation.
There's $7 trillion market demand in AI chips by 2030. I mean, that's where we see the market in 2030. So we think there's so much demand to go around that this may be a time to buy the dip for NVIDIA or buy the dip in other places where you start to see some weakness.
We've seen NVIDIA suffer and Alphabet do well with the recent with Gemini 3 and some of the suggestion that we shouldn't necessarily assume the first mover advantage will prevail forever.
But there's a lot more value to unlock in the Chinese market, but it is too soon to call a winner in this race. So we're invested in both markets, and we think that for the next several months until late next year, this story is going to continue to develop on a similar trajectory.
Well, some of our guests on Insight this week sharing their views on whether the AI fueled gains in equities can continue. Let's get the take from our next guest, Andy Budden from Capital Group. He's still with us out in Singapore. We talked about kind of the changes that we're seeing, productivity and the like, given this whole AI wave, Andy. I'm just wondering, given these concerns about valuations, as we flagged earlier, whether this AI investment spending is really going to bear any sort of fruit anytime soon, where are you on this debate and whether we're in bubble territory or not?
Yeah, so, I mean, firstly, investors absolutely have to be vigilant. So I think it's right to focus on some of these off-balance sheet investments that are going on, also some of the complex private credit structures as well. But at the same time, I think it's also very important to recognize that the stocks have generally gone up actually in line with revenue growth. So I think the risks this time round are a little bit different. Also, I think it's very important to actually kind of think about what history teaches us from when we see these big new disruptive technologies come through. And there is a pretty clear lesson that actually the long-term winners are not necessarily the companies that install the infrastructure of this new technology, so the semiconductors, the hyperscalers and so on. But actually the long-term winners are the companies that use the new technology, in this case artificial intelligence, to really improve their products, improve their productivity, and sometimes to literally create new industries. That's where the long-term winners are. And so very, very important to focus on innovators, so really the innovators that are driving the new economy. And in addition, I think this has profound importance for the broader economy, Yvonne, because artificial intelligence is likely to drive productivity growth to levels which are much higher than people are expecting. We think that productivity growth by the end of the decade could actually be double the level that people are expecting. And obviously that has a big impact on economic growth and all sorts of other variables such as debt sustainability and central bank activity.
So tell us a bit more specifically how you separate the winners now with the losers when it comes to this whole AI sort of story.
Well, incredibly important just to stay focused on fundamentals, Yvonne. So with the semiconductor companies and the hyperscalers, we're just extremely focused on where are the revenues coming from, how sustainable will they be, are those revenues getting translated into profits, and not just what does it look like over the next kind of 1 or 2 years, but really what does it look like out to the end of this decade. But we're also spending a lot of time actually inside companies outside the technology sector to understand how they're embracing artificial intelligence and what it is that they're doing to improve their products and their performance as well.
And that leads to a lot of geopolitics questions too, just given the fact that you have the U.S. and China in some ways doing on separate paths, right? Where the Chinese side of things is really trying to do something that's more of a low spending sort of model per se. How do you see geopolitics really playing out here when it comes to how supply chains are being redrawn and where capital flows are going now, Andy?
Well, It's the new normal. I mean, welcome to the new era of geopolitical rivalry. And whilst it's all very unnerving, actually, we think it's leading to some pretty compelling investment opportunities because companies and countries are really having to adapt to this new environment. So they're having to restructure their economies. They're having to restructure their global supply chains as well. But in addition, we're also very focused on how geopolitics is actually impacting not just trade flows, but also investment flows. So, for example, in Europe, Europe has clearly figured out that it's got to fuel itself. It's going to have to defend itself. It's probably going to have to reinvest in a new economic structure, and they're prepared to pay for it. So Germany is going to be spending more, which means issuing more bonds, which likely means higher yields, which changes investment flows. So it attracts more investment flows, which implicitly are then not going to other markets. So just understanding how geopolitics are impacting these massive flows is critically important for investment success.
And you could say part of this rally is, apart from the geopolitics, right? I mean, the Fed discussion has been one where, can they actually cut in December to one now it seems like they can. And maybe next year even more to come, given that we might have a new Fed chair. The whole liquidity issue, do you think liquidity is what's really driving risk assets here, and can that continue for next year?
Yeah, well, I think liquidity is not just an issue right now, Yvonne. I'd actually argue it's been a big factor in markets really going back over the last 15 years or so. But certainly central bank activity is going to be critical over the next 12 months. And I think what's interesting right now is the idea that the Fed is cutting, actually highly likely to cut in December. The latest commentary from the Fed is clearly more dovish, and the latest jobs market was more bearish. But that's happening at a time when other central banks, their next move is likely to be tightening. And that's actually really part of this great global restructuring again. We're all used to a world where the economy tends to move in the same direction around the world, but clearly the great global restructuring means that that's really changing. So a critical thing for investors to focus on moving forwards. Expect different behaviours around the world, but critically expect that the rest of the world is really going to close the gap on that US exceptionalism.
And should we, this whole kind of U.S. exceptionalism, this kind of dollar dominance that's being in some ways, I guess, questioned as well. I mean, how concerned do you think investors should be about this whole sort of dollar reserve and the sustainability of the U.S. dollar?
Yeah, well, it's the right question, and I think that the answer really falls in two parts. The first part is really the US dollar as the reserve currency, and undoubtedly investors are going to try and find alternatives. But the reality is that the dollar is just coded into the way that the global financial system works. So any change to that status is going to happen very, very gradually. In fact, over the last decade, we saw central bank reserves in the US dollar move from essentially 65% down to 58%. So it's a fairly glacial move. But of course, the other thing we have to focus on is actually the value of the US dollar. And there, it does seem quite likely that we may be moving into an era of more prolonged US dollar weakness. Yeah. And that's really driven by growth differentials and rate differentials. So the rest of the world gradually catching up with the US, especially on real rate differentials, Yvonne.
Andy, it's great to have you. Thank you. Andy Budden there, Head of Solutions for Europe and Asia at Capital Group. Coming up, Hong Kong's iconic bamboo scaffolds have become the villain in the city's worst fire in decades. But is there more behind this tragedy? We'll discuss that next with two experts. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. You're watching Insight. Hong Kong's fire disaster has intensified scrutiny of the city's safety inspection system and whether officials responded forcefully enough to warning signs. Let's get to our China correspondent, Min Lo. She joins us now from a makeshift aid center near the scene of the fire. You're still in Taipo for us, Min. Let's talk a little bit more about what is to come. We've heard of several key events that have already been canceled because of this sort of disaster. And as we continue to see these relief and rescue efforts are underway, there's still a lot of questions about whether we're going to see this election that's about to happen as well. We're still waiting for confirmation on that. But how do you see this tragedy shaping these elections, Min Min?
Yeah, it's definitely going to shape people's perception of how the Hong Kong government is handling this tragedy, right? Because it is not just a corporate failure here. It's not just about the 3 men who were arrested for gross negligence from the company, but it's also because the Department of Labor had already inspected the site of the renovation as recently as a week ago and found all the substandard materials, and yet it seemed like nothing had been done to ensure that those materials were changed. And at the press conference earlier, a reporter did ask if any officials should be stepping down as a result of this and taking responsibility for the issue, and the spokesperson had sidestepped the question. And so, Hong Kong residents will be watching how the government is going to address all these questions around the inspections, the enforcement issues, the oversight. There has been a corruption investigation that is ongoing, a task force set up to look into that. And of course, I should note as well that the Hong Kong Chief Executive John Lee yesterday, early on in his remarks, also thanked Beijing, because Beijing will be watching how Hong Kong handles this. He personally thanked President Xi. He thanked the rescue forces that were dispatched by China's Hong Kong office here. And of course, the Legislative Councillor elections, campaigning has been suspended. John Lee says he will decide later on whether it should be delayed. But it's going to be something that people will be watching, and it's different from what it was a few years ago, pre-national security law, right? Because all the pro-democracy voices has been silenced, and even without this fire, the sky-high property prices has been a perennial issue and a source of discontent for citizens here.
Thank you, our China correspondent Min Lo there on the ground in Tai Po. We did speak with, of course, Hong Kong Legislative Council member Regina Ip, also the former Hong Kong Secretary for Security. She really said it was too early to pass judgment on any government officials or companies involved. The New People's Party chair spoke to us earlier today.
The question is, with such a multi-story building management, can you really rely on owners working as unpaid volunteers to supervise the works? So I think the government need to do more to help the residents. And as your people reported, Labor Department already found some of the materials were not compliant with government standards. And it is really sad that the bamboo scaffolding coupled with the non-fire retardant mesh netting and the dry weather and the windy weather caused the fire to spread so quickly and led to such colossal loss of life and property. It's really sad.
Yeah, we should reiterate as well that the investigations into the construction company that you mentioned are ongoing, and obviously we haven't got to the exact bottom of what went wrong, and also this question over which materials were used and whether they were contravening safety standards. But Regina, you are someone, as a former Secretary for Security, have been in this government position before that Chris Tung now finds himself in today. Do you think that there needs to be any government officials that are also held accountable for what's happened?
I think, again, it's premature to pass judgment on any officials or even on any companies involved. But I think government should take a good look at our existing legislation, whether there are gaps in the requirements about fire retardant materials, not only for construction but also for smaller scale renovations, and to step up the enforcement. I think this should be part of the overall review and investigation to be conducted by government.
What about potential changes to the things like the awarding of contracts, for example? Is that something that you think LegCo should be looking at as well? And should we expect changes there?
There have always been complaints about awarding of contracts because there's a lot of competition for these lucrative works, So the Urban Renewal Authority already providing a service to the owners. They can contract the URA and they will help you assess the value of the contract when you do the tendering. I think this has been done in many instances, but still is a hot area of contention between owners and between competitors for the jobs.
The Hong Kong Chief Executive John Lee visited the site yesterday, and he did announce that $10,000 Hong Kong dollars, that's around $1,300 US, will be handed out to each family that's been affected. Do you think that's sufficient?
There's just immediate relief, clearly insufficient. These people have lost their homes and properties, and some of them will move to a hotel soon. currently the government is offering accommodation in transitional housing, temporary housing in faraway areas, far away from their homes. So they have a lot of adjustment to do, whether for work or for schooling for the children. So the government set up a fund, fundraising. The government contributed 300 million Hong Kong dollars toward a fund for long-term relief for the Wang Fuk Court residents. And I think the latest is we already received 800 million Hong Kong dollars donations from the community. I think more money will be flooding in, including from American corporations and the American Chamber, for which we are grateful.
We're days away now, though, from the heavily promoted legislative elections.
Yes.
Do you think that there's case for those to be postponed? Is that the appropriate response, do you think?
I think there are legal limitations, both from local law and the basic law. I'm sure it's under consideration by the government, and we are waiting to hear from the government. Currently, all political parties have suspended our campaigning activities, and our people are on the ground to help the victims.
That was Hong Kong Legislative Council member and former Secretary for Safety Regina Ip speaking to David and Annabelle earlier on the China show. And it brings this issue, of course, for decades about bamboo scaffolding, right? It's been one of Hong Kong's most iconic sites and a symbol of tradition and ingenuity rising alongside the city's steel and glass towers. But after the deadly fire in Tai Po, questions are now mounting over whether this heritage practice has become a hazard. Joining us now for more is our panel of guests. Huang Xinyan is an associate professor in the Department of Building, Environment and Energy Engineering at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. Also with us from Brisbane is Anwar Orabi, lecturer in the School of Civil Engineering at the University of Queensland. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. I know you guys have worked together before. Anwar, I know you also once lived in Hong Kong, so this issue is very near and dear to all of our hearts here right now. So thank you so much for coming on to talk about this very issue. Xinyan, I'll start with you. From your perspective, why do you think this fire spread so rapidly?
I think there are basically two reasons. First is use of the combustible material, including the bamboo scaffolding, as well as the plastic nettings, and also other construction, flammable construction materials outside of the building, our exterior doors. That definitely provides a vertical channel for fire to spread up very quickly. And I think the second reason is if you look at these buildings, there are some channels between apartments. These channels are used for additional lighting and wind ventilation. But once you have a fire, they create a chimney effect that can bring the hot gas, the hot flame from the bottom to the top very quickly. So both the combustible material plus the chimney effect in these channels contribute to the rapid fire spread.
Anwar, it seems like everyone's been pointing at this whole bamboo scaffolding issue. Can we blame just bamboo scaffolding for this rapid spread of this fire? Or as Xinyan mentioned, right, was it more about the scaffolding materials, right? There was talk about foam that was applied in some of the windows, that mesh netting as well that may have been, did not meet these fire safety standards.
Thank you, Yvonne. So it is a multifaceted problem. I do not think there is going to be a simple answer for such a complex question, unfortunately. So I completely agree with Xinyan that the combustible materials on the scaffolding likely played a very important role. The channels that he talked about is a new hypothesis that is becoming now more and more popular. All of these are going to be investigated very thoroughly, I'm sure, going forward. It is going to be impossible to right now say with certainty which one it is. We might say one or the other now, and we might be wrong, or we might be right, but we need time for us to evaluate the evidence, or for the investigators to evaluate the evidence and actually recreate what they believe happened or what is scientifically shown that could happen to have led to this fire.
Xinyan, a lot of people also question, right, that Hong Kong is a financial hub. It's a very developed city. Why do you think it's been so akin to using this sort of bamboo scaffolding to build homes as well? Why hasn't it been phased out sooner?
I think the people in Hong Kong really respect the tradition, and the people here have been using bamboo for hundreds of years. It's part of their heritage. So, and another reason I think is people here are lucky. There are multiple bamboo scaffolding fire every year, but it does not cause any deaths so far until this big fire. So I just feel people are lucky here, but the luck will not continue. Eventually, there will be a big fire that cause a lot of damage like this time.
And Anwar, some experts have sort of brought up this disaster in Hong Kong and see similarities to what happened in the Grenfell Tower in London. What similarities do you see with that? And did it, the conditions that were there, how challenging was it for firefighters to really kind of bring in their equipment and really try to tackle this fire?
So it is very similar to Grenfell in the sense that it is the vertical flame spread that was perhaps the main reason that the fire safety strategy failed, although that's not the only reason. So when we design a building, we try to limit fire to a compartment, to its source of origin, so that it doesn't develop into something that's uncontrollable. When the fire is at the scale of a building, it's nearly impossible for firefighters to extinguish it. That's why we see until now there's probably fire still burning. There is smoldering happening in some of these compartments, particularly on the top floors. So in the sense that it is the vertical spread that made firefighting quite difficult, or rather impossible, is the main point here. Now, the other point is going to be about where is the failure. So the Grenfell inquiry has made about 46, I think, recommendations for what needs to happen moving forward. And I think there's going to be a lot of change that's going to occur because of this. Unfortunately, in engineering, there is a tendency to design by tragedy, and that's been the case now, and that's been the case after Grenfell. And it's in a way similar to what Xinyan put it. Sometimes we have a fire, the fire is controlled, and then people assume that that's it, that the fire wasn't bad. Many fires could have turned into a tragedy, they just didn't. So there is a bit of a survival bias in a way. So we assume that things are safe until they're proven not. And that's the problem. It's the exceptions that kind of show us the failures of our systems that we have in place. And this is not a Hong Kong problem. This is a worldwide problem. These systems are so complex. These buildings are so complex. There are so many factors that you need to consider. As Xinyan put it earlier, there is the light and ventilation. These are crucial, very, very important for day-to-day life of residents, but they might have contributed to the flame spread in this case.
And Xinyan, as Anwar mentioned, it was the vertical spread. I'm just wondering in terms of, I was looking at some of the video of just how high some of these firefighters and their ladders were. I think they were only kind of close to maybe halfway up some of those buildings here. The challenge of bringing water so high up to skyscrapers that we see here in Hong Kong, is that going to be a big issue as well?
No, I think it's a global challenge. There is basically no good technique to bring the water to these high-rise buildings, especially for those above 100 meters. It's a global challenge. I think it's limited by our modern technology. It's simply hard. And some people say maybe there are some special kind of fire engine that can bring water above 100 meters. But these engines are super large. and it take a long time for these engine deploy, maybe 30 to 40 minutes. But when these engine deploy, after that, it's already too late. So I think it's limited by our current technology. No country, no city in the world can handle these high-rise building fire.
Yeah, Anwar, maybe you can chime in on that. I mean, what role do you think technologies play in all this to ensure maybe safer home building and construction here right now? I mean, we were talking to Regina Ip, and she mentioned, Chinese officials have always questioned why Hong Kong doesn't use drones, for example, in helping in tackling flames, for example. I mean, what role does technology play, you think?
So firefighting is one of the oldest professions that we have, and Hong Kong has a really strong cohort of firefighters as well that tackle urban fires every day. So they're probably amongst the most experienced in the whole world in tackling this kind of fire. Now, it's not enough to just be able to bring water into a building. Just because you have your water hose doesn't mean you can quell any fire. The height, of course, plays a role here. It's really difficult to get up high, and of course, I don't think a drone can get any close to these fires when they're at that scale. I don't think that will be a viable option. I could be proven wrong, of course, but I don't think that's feasible. There is a role, of course, for continuing developing new technologies to try and tackle this as much as possible. But my belief is actually that it's the prevention of this kind of cases that's the most important, which is why the inquiry that's going to happen because of this is going to be crucial. This is such an incredible price to pay, and one that no city or we shouldn't have to pay as a society or as a community, but it is a price that has been paid now for moving forward and trying to establish what's systemically wrong with the way we build buildings.
Yeah. Anwar, you mentioned we talked already about sort of the engineering side of things and maybe the materials issue. To what extent do you think this was a result of a lack of accountability as well, a misconduct as well?
I can't really speak for misconduct yet, at least, because we don't know the facts yet. But once we do know the facts, we'll be able to tell, for example, that was it actually improper material that's been used? Was there, for example, as I've read in some articles, styrofoam used in places where it shouldn't be? So things like styrofoam, for example, they have a rather high heat of combustion. They are not likely to pass any certification for application on a high-rise building. So there's going to be a lot of things that need to be found out and investigated. And once those are found out, then it still won't be simple. It's my former PhD advisor called it an unbroken chain. So there is many links in this chain that led to this failure, and I don't think it's going to be one or two or three people responsible. I think it's going to be many more, unfortunately.
And before we go, I want to ask the same question for both of you, because we've already seen some, at least, discussions or legislation around new public buildings need to be using about 50% of metal scaffolding, for example. In light of what's happened, what do you think is going to be the biggest thing that needs to come out of it, whether it's policy, whether it's building reforms, to avoid and prevent another disaster like this to happen again? Xinyan, I'll start with you.
I think from this morning, the several government officers in Hong Kong has already announced that the bamboo scaffolding will be phasing out to be replaced by the metal ones. I think this is really a good sign. But this is not something we can do just overnight. This is a good start. And I think when the fire investigation continues, we will see more issues. But I think we can come up with engineering solution or policy solutions eventually to take care of these issues to prevent future disasters. But it takes time.
Anwar, I'll give you the final word.
Thank you, Yvonne. So this is a multi-responsibility thing, right? So it is not just policy that's going to be able to fix this alone, unfortunately. who is responsible for the fire safety of buildings? It starts maybe at the very top with the government, but then it goes down the chain. It ends up even with the installers and the manufacturers of the products and what the testing and certification of these products mean. Now, what connects all of these together, I think, is education on fire safety engineering and how a fire safety strategy is developed and how these really complex systems, how the components of these complex systems interact together. Because once that knowledge is available and that once that training is provided and everyone knows what they're exactly going to be responsible for, then things will be able to improve and move forward.
Anwar, Xinyan, thank you so much for joining us here today. Huang Xinyan, they're Associate Professor in the Department of Building, Environment and Energy Engineering at Hong Kong Polytechnic University, and Anwar Orabi, Lecturer in the School of Civil Engineering at the University of Queensland. We have plenty more ahead. This is Bloomberg. Just want to give you an update on what we've been hearing here in the last couple of minutes from the CME Group. So it looks like there's been some live trading when it comes to some commodity futures that have been halted. This is according to some traders. What we have been hearing from a source is that this is due to technical issues that we were seeing from the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. So contracts that have been impacted so far do include the likes of crude oil and palm oil that are affected in the Asia trading session. So we'll continue to watch this one here as well, but still no official response from the CME Group just for now. We'll bring you an update once we do get a bit more clarity on that front here. In the meantime, let's get you caught up with markets here today. We are losing a bit of momentum here. It was, from markets perspective, it was actually a good week when it comes to risk assets here. So we are seeing things pretty much treading water when it comes to Asia Pacific. Hang Seng is slightly lower. Of course, Meituan earnings are certainly on tap here, and we're expecting a pretty bad set of earnings from the food delivery company as well. Nikkei is also flat. Kospi also seeing quite a bit of pullback there. We're down about 1.5%. In terms of Asia FX, certainly this is what we're tracking here this week as well. Given the softness in the dollar, seems like we stabilized a little bit when it comes to the Bloomberg Dollar Index here today. We're at 156 levels for dollar yen, 707. Still some strength when it comes to the renminbi here, and some weakness when it comes to the Korean won. Still ahead on Insight, we have our India focus and really spotlighting the country's upcoming GDP report. We'll preview the growth numbers with Nomura's chief India economist Sonal Varma. But first, the latest power plays in the Philippines as a sister of President Marcos backs his arch rival Sara Duterte to take over. We have the University of the Philippines' Sol Iglesias joining us. Welcome back. You're watching Inside. We're checking markets here this morning. Of course, China, Hong Kong on that lunch break as well. But we are seeing when it comes to lack of risk appetite here as we wrap up this trading week, which has been a good one when it comes to, if you're long these risk assets. But we are seeing things maybe treading water just a bit. U.S. futures, though, are punching slightly higher. Keep in mind, they will be waking up and coming back from that Thanksgiving holiday as well. Dollar has been slightly flat here during the Asia session. So you're not seeing a huge movement when it comes to currencies here this morning. But yes, let's check into some of these, Philippine assets as well. You see the Manila P comp is actually up some 1% or so. So certainly seeing a bit of a recovery there here this morning. Let's stay on the Philippines because the country is caught in a perfect storm, it seems, as it grapples with a multi-billion-dollar corruption scandal implicating lawmakers and top government officials. Now, the President Marcos' sister, Amy, has told Bloomberg that there's now a void in the nation's leadership as she backs her brother's arch rival, Vice President Sara Duterte, as a potential replacement. Let's get to our Manila Bureau Chief, Manny Serapio, who spoke with the Senator Amy Marcos for our story and joins us now from Manila. Manny, very interesting interview. Why do you think Amy is now speaking against her own brother?
Hi. So basically, she told us that she did this. She was speaking out against her brother because out of concern for her brother. She thought that this issue, her claims of her brother using cocaine had been addressed in the past. Obviously, those allegations have been denied by Marcos's office. and saying that, I mean, this week alone, Marcos was saying that she is concerned about her sister, and in fact said that the lady that you see talking on TV is not my sibling. And obviously, this bickering between the siblings is happening at a crucial time for the Philippines, where it's gripped by this multi-billion-dollar, as you said, multi-billion-dollar graft scandal. And one political analyst was saying that Imy's latest comments do not help the Philippines or this nation rise from this mess. And what we need is more clarity, more evidence, rather than controversy.
And it's interesting, she's putting her support behind his arch rival, the Vice President Sara Duterte now. Why?
Basically, she told us that her ties with the Dutertes began when she was a lawmaker alongside the former president, Rodrigo Duterte. And then from there on out, she had this association with the Dutertes. And during the last midterm elections in May, basically she famously, if you would call it that, quit her brother's slate and then joined Sara Duterte on her senatorial campaign. And what we saw obviously is Marcos, that is being able to secure re-election, and that paid off for her. And then we saw Marcos's Senate slate being having had an underwhelming performance, which obviously pushed the president to make sure that the government would act in the interest of the people, because the voting outcomes showed that the people are quite unsatisfied with the government.
And what does this mean for the Philippines, Manny, given that it's still in the middle of this graft scandal, as you mentioned? I think there's still protests that are going to be scheduled for this weekend as well.
I think the opinion of the majority is that it takes attention away from the bigger issue, which is the graft corruption that's unfolding, that has affected the economy. The third quarter growth was far slower than expected, affected the peso and then the stock market, although we're seeing some recovery today. But the thing is, investor sentiment has basically been dampened because of this scandal that's going on. So what people are saying, that's why we're having another protest on Sunday, which is in commemoration of a public holiday for a national hero, and because people still want to see those tied to this graft scandal be held to account.
Manny, thank you. Our Manila Bureau Chief, Manny Serapio there. Joining us now is Sol Iglesias, Assistant Professor at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Sol, it's great to have you. Certainly this development has been quite interesting, but there's still a lot of lingering questions about the future of Marcos Jr. now. Do you think he can survive this graft scandal?
Well, that is the big question. It's very difficult to predict. What's certain is that there is a lot of instability right now. There's a sense of a crisis in the air. We must recall that this current public infrastructure corruption scandal has elicited expose after expose since the president himself opened this can of worms in early July as part of his State of the Nation address, where he called out this. He made this sort of strident call, just have some shame, right? Mahiya naman kayo. And in front of Congress, and it only later over the subsequent days and weeks did it emerge what he meant. He was, it was a president-led expose initially of this sort of intertwining between private contractors, particularly for flood control infrastructure, and Congress and the budgetary process. But what later unfolded in many of these exposés was a system of plunder involving different agencies in the government, as well as elected politicians. And now the accusation is that it goes all the way to the top, to Malacanang, with President Marcos himself involved.
Yeah, I mean, can you tell us a bit more about how this scandal compares to previous ones we've seen that's, engulfed governments? I mean, this time around, we've actually seen 2 cabinet ministers, both have left the government as well. How entrenched, how systemic do you think this sort of mismanagement is?
Yeah, this is unprecedented in terms of the amounts of corruption that we're talking about. The reason why one of the major protests is called the Trillion Peso March is because the magnitude of the potential magnitude of the money we're talking about is reaching those levels. The most recent huge, crisis-inducing corruption scandal was in many ways far more contained under the presidency of Benigno Aquino III, or Noynoy Aquino. There was this scandal over development projects, which resulted in, also massive protests, and resulted also in a reform, basically the doing away, initially, it seemed, of pork barrel, or money that goes to discretionary funds, particularly for members of the legislature. But then, as we've seen, pork barrel has just transformed. And in this case, the present infrastructure scandal has shown really that it's systemic now. It's not just restricted to a particular fund. It involves the entire budgetary process. And it has implicated members of Congress, senators, the Department of Budget, the Commission on Audit. And so all the checks and balances against corruption are not working. In fact, they have been subverted.
And so you make a good point. I think what makes it different this time around is also the public anger on the streets, right? We've seen, many protests about, this whole very issue, and it seems like they're keeping this flood scandal in the news. How much do you think public anger can actually spark change?
So another element of the context is that this is happening at a time where we've seen massive protests topple governments in South Asia, like in Nepal and Bangladesh. And in recent months, major protests caused the rolling back of major policies in Indonesia, particularly a housing allowance that legislators were giving themselves. So, the possible outcomes seem to range between massive reform and the government having to save face. We've seen, as you said, resignations from the cabinet, and there are ongoing investigations by an independent commission, but appointed by the president. And then the more extreme outcome is a potential change in government, either through a constitutional process or an extra constitutional process. And the Philippines is replete with examples of these kinds of protests leading to massive outcomes.
I mean, it seems like, the time is ticking for the president to do something. I mean, how can he turn this around in terms of, we've seen this already hit the likes of, growth. It's hit the markets and weighed on investor confidence in the Philippines. What does he still need to do to restore that public trust and investor confidence?
Well, first of all, the president needs to be innocent of these charges. If there is evidence that comes out that really is convincing to the public that he is impeachable, for example, then it's very difficult to imagine how the president will be able to survive such a blow. Because for now, for instance, these accusations, particularly by former lawmaker Zaldico, who had headed the budgetary process before he fled the country, he's not come home. And one critical step would be for him to come home, face the allegations against him, but also substantiate the kind of allegations he's made against the president himself. Otherwise, the procedure that has been put in place may seem to continue or may likely continue. These exposés and the evidence has been unfolding, but mainly against, yes, people in power, but not all the way up to the top. But I must also remind us that Sara Duterte herself had been impeached over corruption in the vice president's office, as well as in her capacity for a time as Secretary of Education. That impeachment process was in some derailed. But this means that both the president and the vice president, there are very serious allegations of wrongdoing that have been lobbed against them and have not really found a full airing in terms of procedure. And that's why people are taking to the streets, right? Because ultimately, it's this kind of pressure from protests that will keep these processes as honest as possible.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought in the fact about Sara Duterte. I mean, she, as you've mentioned, she herself faced complaints about misuse of public funds, which she has denied. But she's also now seen as a leading contender in the 2028 presidential polls. What is the future of Sara Duterte now?
Well, it seems that she has two pathways to the presidency. Because she was not impeached, she can still run for election. I mean, she was never tried and convicted over these corruption charges. She is not disqualified from running for office in 2028. And yes, she could be a leading contender as she is now.
Oh, all right. We may have lost connection with Sol there. But our thanks to Sol Iglesias, assistant professor at the University of Philippines, Diliman there, really highlighting really the challenges and really the how this is all going to develop here in the next few months or so. But yeah, as we talked about, there are still some protests being scheduled this weekend on Sunday in the Philippines in light of this Graft scandal. All right, we'll continue to track what's going on, but yes, we're going to move on to talk about other stories that we're following today. The Japanese government has denied a report that President Trump advised Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi to avoid provoking China over Taiwan. The Wall Street Journal report says Trump gave Takaichi subtle advice on China during their call this week, but did not pressure her to retract her recent comments. Japan's government says it has made an inquiry to the Journal over the story. President Trump is pushing for deeper immigration curbs after 2 National Guard members were shot near the White House. An Afghan national and was taken into custody after the attack. And the White House is halting Afghan immigration proceedings and ordering a review of those already in the country. This raises the risk that settlement rights for Afghan allies of the U.S. may be curtailed. And still ahead this hour with the outlook on India's economy ahead of third quarter figures due later on today. Sonal Varma of Nomura joins us live. This is Bloomberg. We are tracking the latest when it comes to Hong Kong's deadliest fire in decades, which has killed at least 94 people and injured 76. We are hearing that there is going to be another press briefing from the fire department at around 2 p.m. local time here. So we'll see if we get any updates on really how things are progressing in the recovery efforts and the like. But certainly there has been a lot of ongoing debate about the fire safety standards and the like, and questions of whether officials responded forcefully enough to warning signs. However, Legislative Council member and former Secretary for Security, Regina Ip, says it's too early to pass judgment on any government officials or companies involved.
The question is, with such a multi-story building management, can you really rely on owners working as unpaid volunteers to supervise the works? So I think the government need to do more to help the residents. And as your people reported, Labor Department already found some of the materials were not compliant with government standards. And it is really sad that the bamboo scaffolding coupled with the non-fire retardant mesh netting and the dry weather and the windy weather caused the fire to spread so quickly and led to such colossal loss of life and property. It's really sad.
Yeah, we should reiterate as well that the investigations into the construction company that you mentioned are ongoing, and obviously we haven't got to the exact bottom of what went wrong, and also this question over which materials were used and whether they were contravening safety standards. But Regina, I mean, you are someone, as a former Secretary for Security, have been in this government position before that Chris Tung now finds himself in today. Do you think that there needs to be any government officials that are also held accountable for what's happened?
I think, again, it's premature to pass judgment on any officials or even on any companies involved. But I think government should take a good look at our existing legislation, whether there are gaps in the requirements about fire retardant materials, not only for construction but also for smaller scale renovations, and to step up the enforcement. I think this should be part of the overall review and investigation to be conducted by government.
What about potential changes to the things like the awarding of contracts, for example? Is that something that you think LegCo should be looking at as well? And should we expect changes there?
There have always been complaints about awarding of contracts because there's a lot of competition for these lucrative works, So the Urban Renewal Authority already providing a service to the owners. They can contract the URA and they will help you assess the value of the contract when you do the tendering. I think this has been done in many instances, but still is a hot area of contention between owners and between competitors for the jobs.
The Hong Kong Chief Executive John Lee visited the site yesterday, and he did announce that $10,000 Hong Kong dollars, that's around $1,300 US, will be handed out to each family that's been affected. Do you think that's sufficient?
There's just immediate relief, clearly insufficient. These people have lost their homes and properties, and some of them will move to a hotel soon. But currently, the government is offering accommodation in transitional housing, temporary housing in faraway areas, far away from their homes. So they have a lot of adjustment to do, whether for work or for schooling for the children. So the government set up a fund, fundraising. The government contributed 300 million Hong Kong dollars toward a fund for long-term relief for the Wang Fuk Court residents. And I think the latest is we already received 800 million Hong Kong dollars donations from the community. I think more money will be flooding in, including from American corporations and the American Chamber, for which we are grateful.
We're days away now, though, from the heavily promoted legislative elections.
Yes.
Do you think that there's case for those to be postponed? Is that the appropriate response, do you think?
I think there are legal limitations, both from local law and the basic law. I'm sure it's under consideration by the government, and we are waiting to hear from the government. Currently, all political parties have suspended our campaigning activities, and our people are on the ground to help the victims.
And that was Hong Kong Legislative Council member and former Secretary for Safety, Regina Ip, speaking to Bloomberg. Let's get the latest now with Min Min Lo, our China correspondent. She's joining us now live in Taipo. And Min Min, I understand there is going to be another press briefing from the fire department in just a few hours. What's expected there?
That's right. We are now stationed just in front of that fire truck where the press briefing will be held. I think you can see the podiums being set up there. There has clearly been a bit of chaos here from the fire service department because earlier we were told that the press briefing was going to be at 1 p.m. and then they moved it out to 12:30, and then later we found out it was going to be cancelled, and then they said it was going to be delayed to 2 p.m. The reason being that they are still verifying some information. We knew the fire department had said that after they completed all the search and rescue and the forcible entry into every single unit to check for any trapped persons left behind, they would give us an update of the latest death toll, injury toll, and the number of people that are still missing and unaccounted for. So we are waiting for that information. And of course, it's aside from what the fire department has said, we're also waiting for answers, right, when it comes to who should be held accountable for this massive fire that is a tragedy brutality that we haven't seen in years in Hong Kong, because 3 people from the engineering company has been arrested for manslaughter and for gross negligence. But also worth pointing out that the Department of Labor already inspected the site of the renovation several times, including as recently as last week, and they were well aware of the substandard materials being used and the risk of fire, and yet somehow nothing was done to prevent this fire. And also residents are also concerned about the other issues, including the lack of a fire alarm being activated. Residents say they didn't hear anything, and some residents said they didn't realize that their buildings were burning. They smelled something, but they didn't realize until a security guard knocked on their doors, calling them to evacuate. And the lack of the fire alarm really reduced the time for them, especially considering when there are many elderly residents, some of them wheelchair bound, and it's not very easy for them to get out of the building.
Yeah, that's very horrific just hearing that. Certainly there's a lot of questions about the safety enforcement side of things. As you mentioned, I think it was as early as last week when Hong Kong officials had raised the concerns with the renovators of that complex. Tell us a bit more about just, where you are. Obviously, there's been an outpouring of support from the public and private sector here so far, people giving out donations and the like. It's been quite an overwhelming response.
Yes, it's really heartening to see the community coming together, because we passed by some of the evacuation centers and they are actually rejecting further donations, which tells you that they are already well resourced with all the outpour of donations coming in. Everything from blankets and sheets, but also the corporate donors, tens of millions of Hong Kong dollars donated from the likes of Xpeng, Xiaomi, Tencent, the Hong Kong conglomerates as well. Really very heartening to see that.
Yeah. Min, thank you, Min Lo there. Plenty more ahead. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. You're watching Inside. We got an update here when it comes to what we heard from the CBOE. So they were talking about why they had to halt trading when it comes to the global trading hours activity after the CME systems issue disrupted futures trading and market data dissemination. So from what we're hearing from the Chicago Mercantile Exchange is that the markets were halted due to a cooling issue at the data centers. So that is what we're hearing so far. Officials are saying that here. So that halt has covered all proprietary index options. So SPX, SPXW, VIX, as well as XSP. And the decision followed consultations with some of their liquidity providers as well. So the trading did stop as of 10:49 p.m. Eastern time. So we're tracking here today how long this will last. But this is what we're hearing so far officially from the CME. In the meantime, let's get you caught up with what's going on when it comes to Indian markets as well. Of course, markets have been trading there for about close to an hour now. Of course, ahead of its GDP release for the third quarter, right? You're seeing the Sensex continue on up about 1/5%. Everyone's calling about this whole new cycle that's underway in India. Maybe that leads to the Nifty to outperform next year. Let's get a preview now on what to expect out of the growth figures coming out later on today. Our very own Menika Doshi is joining us live from Mumbai. Menika, what are we expecting?
Hi, good morning, Yvonne. We're expecting a number that's near 7% or above that, and that indicates a strong continuing growth for the Indian economy. Economists are also converging around an expectation of a 25 basis point cut in the next monetary policy announcement in December, and that's because inflation has come in at below 1%, 0.25% in the last print, significantly undershooting the central bank's estimates. And this raises three quick questions. One, what does that mean for nominal growth? And that will impact corporate earnings and the government's fiscal calculation. The second important one is whether this growth that we see above 7% can be sustained in the second half. And that comes down to the strength of the consumption recovery. And the third one, of course, which we have no answer to, which is when will the India-US trade deal happen? Because that is weighing on segments of the economy. They're small segments, but it is an important burden.
Certainly, as Monica, stick around. We'll have more. Let's bring in Sonal Varma, Nomura's chief economist for India and Asia ex-Japan. Sonal, it's always great to have you on the program. Yeah, as Monica highlighted, right, they're seeing some conflicting signals when it comes to India's growth. They're still expecting 7% growth, which is still quite strong. Obviously, when it comes to record low inflation. But then again, I look at a rupee that is at near record lows. I look at when it comes to exports that have plummeted. Should we look at the headline number and suggest things are looking okay?
It is a puzzle, Yvonne. I think, we are expecting a 7.6% for the GDP print today. What is important is to, look back a year, and that particular quarter last year, actually, we saw GDP dip to 5.6%. So there is actually an adverse base effect that is at play. So if you look at the sequential momentum on a quarter-on-quarter basis, we think GDP will be up around 1.5% quarter-on-quarter seasonally adjusted. So it's a decent number, but it's not as positive as the headline year-over-year growth of 7.5 plus suggests. So there should be a broad-based increase across sectors, but we do think, looking at the whole set of indicators, that the output gap in India is probably still slightly negative, which is why we are seeing subdued core inflation still in India. So it's a confusing headline print, but the underlying picture is a bit more nuanced than what the headlines suggest.
Yeah, and certainly there's been so much optimism around, GST cuts, this festive demand. I mean, that certainly is helping the consumer side of things. But how are you seeing consumption demand holding up here right now? And can that momentum last?
Yeah, we are at the margin more positive on consumption. I think with the GST cuts, there's a lot of volatility around consumption. So we did see a big dip into the GST implementation and a big pent-up demand, which is what we are seeing right now on consumption. So I think the real trend on consumption will be visible post November, December in terms of where the steady state settles down. Now, in terms of the more fundamental drivers of consumption, I think one of the biggest positives has been this low inflation, because that is boosting real disposable income for households. And of course, you've had the personal income tax cuts and the GST cuts, which is a positive at the margin. But I think lower inflation is sort of a more sustainable positive. What we are still looking at also is to what extent job creation and income growth picks up in India, because nominal salary growth has moderated over the course of the last 12-18 months, and household credit, which was one of the drivers of consumption, had also moderated. But we are seeing early signs of a pickup in credit, and this has been led by consumer credit in particular. So I think on the whole, things will probably settle down a bit lower than where we are right now because of GST, but still better than what the last 12 months have been for consumption.
The flip side of those GST cuts, Sonal, is also the fact that we are expecting some weakness in government tax revenue collection, and that's also a challenge that the nominal GDP number will throw up. Can you talk us through how you assess the fisc in the second half of this year?
Yeah, absolutely. I think both the personal income tax cut as well as the GST cut, along with the moderation in nominal GDP growth. So for the September quarter, we're expecting nominal GDP growth to moderate to 8.1% from 8.8%. So the combination of slower nominal GDP growth and the tax cuts do mean that the net tax revenue growth will be substantially below what the government has budgeted. And for this financial year, we're looking at tax collections undershooting the government's estimate by between 0.3 to 0.4% of GDP. That said, we do think that the government's commitment to the 4.4% fiscal deficit target is quite strong, and this being the final year of the fiscal glide path before India shifts to debt targeting, I think the signaling is quite important from policy perspective. So, the way to square the circle, therefore, is that the government spending in the next 6 months, both in terms of the pace of capital expenditure growth as well as the pace of revenue expenditure growth, we do think will moderate. And that's one reason why we think GDP growth from the 7+ that we've seen in first half will moderate back to around 6.5% in second half of FY26.
But government spending has been a big pillar to this economy and a big contributor to the 7% growth. So do you see private sector slowly crowding in, or, over the last several months to be able to take up the space that the government vacates, at least over the next half year and the year after that?
I think this cycle is very different, Menaka, in terms of, we've been waiting for this private capex to pick up for a very long time now. And I think what we've seen is really pockets of what is driving private investment. So there's been a big thrust, of course, from the government side on roads, railways, etc., ports. The pace of increase in government capex may not be as sharp as we've seen in the last 5 years, 20-25% per annum. But we do think government capex will be as strong as the nominal GDP growth of around 10% per annum. So that push will continue, and that in turn sort of crowds in specific sectors like steel, cement, for instance. Second is essentially your renewables and related themes, where we think the investments will continue as India tries to build more supply chain on the green tech side. Third is your self-sufficiency driven investments. So in the case of defense, building the critical mineral supply chain, which is a long-term game plan, but the investments around that will start. And fourth is the manufacturing, specifically the global value chain integration. So far, India has mainly seen the success on electronics in the smartphone side, but essentially greater backward integration on electronics supply chain, but basically implementing this strategy across the other, what we call the low-tech manufacturing sectors like toys, textiles, furniture, etc., is also something that will come through. So it's, specific areas where we are likely to see more capex come through. Services sector, in any case, don't tend to be as capex intensive. So I do think we will see some pickup in investments, but it's a different flavor from what we've been used to in the past.
And Sonal, we talked about the GST cuts. That certainly has helped at least cushion growth so far, given that we still don't have a trade deal with the U.S. and with India, and certainly there's still that lingering uncertainty. If we don't get a deal, what are your expectations? What could the hit to the broader economy be?
I think we're already seeing the impact of higher U.S. tariffs, because India's exports to U.S. have been contracting for the last couple of months. In some product categories, we've seen export diversification, but on the whole, there is pressure on the labor-intensive sectors in the MSMEs particularly. So, cash flow, profit margins for these companies is under pressure. Capex is getting delayed. I think over the medium term, though, as India tries to diversify its export, we will see some diversification as an offset. But, if India were to continue at a 50% US tariff, then on an annualized basis, we think the hit could be around 0.5 percentage points. Nevertheless, when we look at the next 12 months, India has also seen a lot of counter-cyclical policy easing in terms of, interest rate cuts, liquidity easing, macroprudential easing in order to boost credit. So I do think some of these factors will offset US tariff over the next 12 months. And over the medium term, the focus remains on export diversification.
Sonal, one quick question of, exactly what you spoke of supporting exporters and other reform measures by the government. It seems cognizant of this potential pressure on growth. And so we've had, through the course of this year, the tax cuts, more recently the labor reform measures, direct and indirect support to exporters. Is that going to be enough? And is there something else specifically that you're looking forward to from the government reform agenda point of view?
I think a lot more in the direction of improving ease of doing business. So I think, the committee that has been set up in terms of decriminalizing a lot of the laws, we would expect more to come through on that front. On factor market reforms, we've seen the moves on the labor market. We could potentially see more on land reforms, for instance. Also, in terms of attracting more foreign direct investment into India in more sectors, inviting foreign investment in sectors like atomic energy, more investment in insurance, allowing more investment in banking sector going forward. So I do think a mix of ease of doing business reforms, factor market reforms, attracting more foreign investment, while trying to boost domestic demand and increase self-sufficiency on the supply chain and the GVC integration. So it's going to be a mix of everything. But essentially, the signal here is that India remains open to business.
Where does that leave the RBI, Sonal? I mean, when you have record low inflation, is a cut in the rate cutting cycle still very much is still live at this point? I mean, there's a lot of central banks around Asia now who are in some ways signaling they could be at the end of their rate cutting cycles now.
India is sort of unique in that sense. The combination of high growth and low inflation does mean that the central bank is not in as much of a rush. But I think, monetary policy needs to be forward-looking. And while the current growth numbers look pretty strong, the RBI's own projection is that the 6 to 12-month forward growth will be closer to 6.5%, i.e. we are not moving into a scenario where the output gap is significantly positive. There's been no trade deal. We've seen the transmission of the rate cuts that have already been announced, the front-loaded rate cuts, and inflation is exaggerated on the downside because of food inflation, but the underlying inflation measures are also tracking less than 3%. And we think inflation will stay below the RBI's 4% target at least till middle, if not the third quarter of 2026. So it is essentially the space to cut does exist. The central bank has also communicated the same. So we do think that the rate cut is likely on 5th of December, and we're expecting another cut after that, so 5% on the terminal rate.
All right. We'll see how things go next Friday there for the RBI. Sonal, thank you so much. Sonal Varma there, Chief Economist for India and Asia, ex-Japan at Nomura. And, of course, our thanks to Vinay Doshi. We just got some breaking news coming through from President Trump. So he just posted here on Truth Social about how he will permanently pause migration from third world countries to allow the U.S. system to fully recover and terminate all the millions of Biden illegal admissions. Now, this is, of course, on the back of that deadly shooting there in D.C. this week. So certainly this is what we've been hearing so far. We're still kind of getting some more clarity here on what exactly which third world countries President Trump is alluding to here right now. But he says even if we have progressed technologically, immigration policy has eroded those gains and living conditions for many. I will permanently pause migration from all third world countries to allow the U.S. system to fully recover. This, of course, as we've been talking about in the light of this deadly shooting in Washington, D.C., which did involve a Afghan national. So certainly that's going to be one thing to watch here in the next day as Wall Street wakes up. And coming up, though, we're talking a bit more about China seeking wider international support over its feud with Japan after Prime Minister Takaichi angered Beijing with comments about Taiwan. We'll break down the latest diplomatic developments next. This is Bloomberg. Well, China's top diplomat has used a phone call with his French counterpart to seek support in Beijing's dispute with Japan over Taiwan. Let's get to our China economy and government reporter, Colin Murphy, joining us live out of Beijing. Colin, it's interesting. We've seen China continue this kind of trying to gather some diplomatic support around this whole very issue. Tell us, have we heard from the French? How is this being received?
So the statement so far is basically from the Chinese side. And they reached out in the call last night and they talked to Emmanuel Bon, who's one of Macron's closest advisors. And in that they called for mutual support and they want sort of support specifically on the Japan issue with Takaichi. So the comments from Takaichi, as I think we all know at this point, have really upset Beijing. And they're using this in whatever way they can to outreach to different countries and try to get support against Japan on this incident. And the call with Bonn is the latest example of that.
Yeah, and there is going to be a state visit from the French president, Emmanuel Macron, next week in Beijing. What's expected there?
So I guess, the phone call last night is setting the stage for that. And, Macron will be here towards the end of next week. We're hearing that he'll have 2 city visits, including Beijing and Chengdu. The question, of course, is whether France will actually do anything on the Chinese request. I doubt it, to be frank. I think they will want to reiterate their consistent sort of stance on Taiwan. They'll be stressing stability. So I think the Chinese attempt to get more blatant and more explicit support on the Japan-Taiwan issue probably won't come to anything with France.
Thank you, Colin Murphy there, our China economy and government reporter joining us live from Beijing. Along with geopolitical tensions, global markets are also watching, of course, this AI boom closely for signs of a possible bubble. Here's what some of our guests have been telling us about the potential risks in the space.
There's been a lot of talk about an AI bubble. From our vantage point, we see something very different.
What's different in this cycle is the problem we have right now is supply, not demand.
What you see with the level of spending that they're putting into it. So it's a lot and it's moving fast. But the difference between now and 2000 is that these are massive companies with strong financial performance.
A lot of the bubble could be potentially in terms of the run-up on the valuation side. But the fundamentals of the industry, I think, is a long-term trend.
My stance generally is that bubbles are a good thing because they mobilize capital and talent into important problems, important sectors. And I think we are in a really interesting time.
Many companies about a year ago were waiting to see what was going to happen with the AI bubble, but now no company will have the stomach today to wait for what might happen. The question that companies are asking themselves today is, are they moving fast enough?
I think, over to say 10 or 100 years, I think we'll gradually underestimate the technology that is AI.
Now, Taiwanese chipmaker Foxconn is a company with deep ties to both NVIDIA and OpenAI, and it's relying on them as it embarks on a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing push in the U.S. to meet the enormous needs of the AI sector. We asked Foxconn Chairman Yong Liu if he has concerns about circular financing in the industry.
I look at from the user's point of view, the use of the model. Okay, from that angle, as a user for this large language model for our manufacturer, for our daily uses, we have a great potential for the use of that capabilities. We know that, and it's not just for us; it's for all businesses. They need it, so the demands are there. How to fulfill it, and in what way, in terms of finance. They will figure out a way. As long as there's demands, I think people are concerned about whether the demands are not real.
What about the monetization, though? Because that is also a concern. How can a company like OpenAI, for instance, with such a big spend on infrastructure, get enough revenue to make the financials make sense, essentially? I mean, are you concerned about still joining forces or signing this MOU with a company that's not even yet profitable?
Look at this, they have 800 million users nowadays already. If they can get, let's say $100 a year, that's about 80 billion a year.
Yes, if people are prepared to spend that much, I think is the
100,
question.
not 1,000. Okay, so if you calculate per user revenue, that's maybe achievable. And it's up to them, what kind of products that they're going to provide. Okay. So, like, they have this, they formed a joint venture with law firm, with Johnny Ive, called I.O., the company called I.O. They're trying to come out with new edge devices, right? If that comes, something, will happen.
But the fortunes of companies.
That was, of course, Foxconn's leader there, Yong Liu. We're going to recap what's been going on here when it comes to the CME futures. So trading has stopped on Friday after what the company is saying here at the exchange about a data center glitch. So we're talking about trading of futures of options there that have been impacted, including U.S. crude oil, gasoline, and palm oil as well. Also impacting some contracts of treasuries and S&P 500 futures there. We'll give you an update once we see more. That's it for us here on Insight. Horizons Middle East and Africa is next.